I'm David Martinez. Senshaba. I lost my job, my wife, and my home. Then an old woman found me sleeping in my car and said, "Your grandfather left you everything." I remember the moment the bailiff called my name. Ethan Carter. My stomach tightened as if someone had pulled a knot inside me. I stood up and followed my lawyer, Constance Hale, to the long wooden table in the center of the courtroom. The air smelled like old paper and disinfectant. It was a Tuesday morning in Phoenix. Too warm for a suit. And yet the cold air from the vents made my hands shake. Across from me sat Brooke. She looked perfect. As always. Perfect hair. Perfect dress. Perfect posture. The same woman who once laughed at my stupid jokes over cheap beer now stared through me as if I were a stranger asking for spare change. Roger Blake sat beside her. Roger. My former friend. Now her attorney. Tapping his pen with that smug little rhythm he used when he knew he had control of the room. Judge Collins entered. Everyone rose. The gavel hit once. The sound was sharp enough to make my teeth clench. The hearing began with Roger reading from a folder, as if he were auditioning for a play. He said I had been unstable since losing my job, that I drank too much, cried too often, and couldn't provide emotional stability. When he said emotional stability, he looked right at me and smiled. Brooke whispered something to him and laughed softly. I tried to keep my face blank. Constance leaned toward me and whispered, "Breathe. Don't give them the show they want." Then Brooke spoke. "Your Honor." I spent years supporting him, trying to build his confidence. But a woman can only carry a man for so long. He cries at every setback. Every little thing. I just want peace. A murmur moved through the gallery. Someone coughed. Someone else chuckled under their breath. My throat tightened. And I felt that familiar burn behind my eyes. "Don't cry. Not here." Judge Collins turned to me. "Mr. Carter. Do you have a response?" I tried to speak. But my voice cracked. I just wanted to make things right. I didn't want this." Brooke sighed dramatically, as if my words proved her point. That was when I felt it. One tear slid down before I could stop it. A camera clicked somewhere in the back. My humiliation became public record in a flash. Roger smiled wider. "Your Honor. I think that says enough." The gavel hit again. Order. Constance stood. "Your Honor. I believe there are relevant documents not yet reviewed. My client recently received notice regarding the estate of his late uncle, Richard Fairbanks. We'd request the court allow us to present those materials before final judgment." Roger's smirk faltered for the first time. "This is a divorce case, not probate court." Constance's voice stayed calm. "It is both now. The estate directly affects Mrs. Carter's financial claim." Brooke frowned. "What are you talking about?" Constance didn't answer her. She just handed an envelope to the clerk. I could see my name written in Richard's old-fashioned handwriting. Judge Collins looked over his glasses. "We'll review this material tomorrow. Court is adjourned until then." The gavel struck again, and everyone began to rise. Reporters buzzed like flies, whispering, writing, ready to turn my tears into a headline. Brooke brushed past me on her way out, her perfume sharp and familiar. "You just made this worse for yourself," she said without looking at me. Roger followed her, straightening his tie. "See you tomorrow, buddy." When they were gone, I stayed seated. My chest felt heavy. But Constance placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Don't mistake silence for defeat," she said. "This isn't over." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her. I stared at the empty courtroom, the judge's bench, the wooden railings, the echo of laughter that still seemed to hang in the air. Outside, the sunlight hit me like a slap. A couple of reporters called my name, asking how it felt to be humiliated in court. I didn't answer. I just walked to the parking lot, loosened my tie, and sat in my old Chevy. The steering wheel was hot enough to burn, but I didn't care. For the first time, I let the tears come without fighting them. I thought of the man I used to be, the life I thought I had, somewhere in the distance. A siren wailed, cutting through the Arizona heat. Constance's words echoed in my head. "It isn't over." I wiped my face, started the engine, and stared ahead. Tomorrow they'd open that envelope with my name on it. Whatever was inside might be my last chance to prove I wasn't the weak man they thought I was. I drove until the courthouse disappeared behind me. Until the city noise gave way to the hum of tires on cracked asphalt. The desert stretched out on both sides. Endless and dry. Just like my thoughts. I didn't go home right away. Home didn't feel like a place anymore. It was just a house that used to smell like Brooks vanilla candles and fresh coffee. Now it smelled like nothing. Like absence. I stopped at a diner on the outskirts of Glendale. The kind with peeling red booths and a waitress who called everyone honey. I ordered coffee I didn't want and stared out the window at a truck stop sign blinking in the heat. I could still hear Brooks' voice in my head. That little laugh when she said I cried too easily. She used to say it softly. As if teasing. Somewhere along the way, it turned into a weapon. Losing my job had been the first crack in everything. I used to work for Metagenics Pharmaceuticals, running a sales division out of Phoenix. 8 years of building trust, hitting numbers, mentoring younger reps. I wasn't rich, but I was proud of what I did. Roger was my closest friend back then. We started at the same time, shared cheap beer after long conferences, and joked that one day we'd run the company together. That was before the Henderson account. It was supposed to be my promotion ticket, a multi-million-dollar contract. I stayed up nights working those projections, believing hard work still meant something. The morning of the presentation, my keycard didn't work. Roger was waiting in the lobby with security. He looked nervous, like he didn't want to be there. But the words came easily. "Ethan, we need to talk." I can still see his desk. The neat stack of papers. My name printed across a termination form. He said there had been accounting discrepancies in my expense reports. I laughed at first, thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the folder. Dinner receipts. Travel reimbursements. All signed with my name. But half of them weren't mine. He'd forged enough to make it look believable. When I tried to explain, he said, "Look, I'm sorry. It's out of my hands. Corporate made the call." He wouldn't look at me when I left. I remember walking to my car with my box of things, my tie hanging loose, trying to convince myself that Brooke would understand, that she'd say, "We'll figure it out." She didn't. She just stared at me when I told her, then turned away and said she needed air. A week later, she suggested I take a break from working. "Maybe you just need time to find yourself," she said. I thought she meant to support me. What she really meant was she didn't want to be near failure. I tried freelance consulting, a few online clients, even sold my truck to cover the mortgage. She stopped sleeping in our bed and started posting pictures with her friends at wine tastings and weekend retreats. Every time I brought up the bills, she said, "Don't make this about money. Ethan, that's all you ever think about." I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about survival. One night, I found an email she'd left open. It was from Roger. The subject line said, "When this is over." The rest was short, careful, like they'd practiced hiding it. "You deserve better. Soon it will all be settled." I sat there for an hour, staring at the screen, trying to decide if I was angrier at her or at myself for not seeing it sooner. Now, sitting in that diner years later, I felt that same dull ache. Betrayal doesn't come like lightning. It comes like slow erosion until one day you realize everything solid has turned to dust. The waitress refilled my cup. "You okay?" "Honey," she asked. I nodded. Even though I wasn't. I left cash on the counter and stepped outside. The air smelled of gasoline and sunburnt metal. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was from Grace, Constance's assistant. "Found something you'll want to see. Meet me at the office in an hour." I drove into downtown Phoenix, the heat waves rising off the asphalt like ghosts. Hale and Browning LLP was in an old building near Central Avenue, the kind with marble floors and air conditioning that actually worked. Grace met me in the lobby, a young woman with sharp eyes and no patience for small talk. She handed me a tablet. On the screen was an email thread between Roger and Brooke. My stomach turned as I read it. "Keep him calm until the hearing." Roger had written, "Once the divorce is final, you'll get the settlement and we can move forward quietly." Brooke had replied, "He's starting to ask questions. If this backfires, I'm blaming you," Grace said softly. "Constance pulled this from a subpoena request to Metagenics. Roger used his company email. Not very smart. I stared at the messages. My chest felt tight. But not from pain this time. It was something colder. He used to be my friend. I said. Grace shrugged. Some people can't handle other people's decency. Makes them feel small. Constance walked in then. Holding a folder. She looked at me over her glasses. There's something else you should know. Richard Fairbanks's estate isn't small. It could change everything about this case. I frowned. I hadn't seen my uncle in 15 years. He was my mother's brother. A quiet man who'd built a fortune out of real estate and investments. We'd exchanged Christmas cards until one year he just stopped. I always assumed he'd forgotten about me. Constance set the folder down. He didn't forget. His attorney contacted me last week. There's a sealed document in your name. It can only be opened in court. What does that even mean? It means tomorrow might be the day the truth changes sides. She said it simply. But her words stuck with me long after I left the office. That night, I sat in the dark living room of my empty house. The sound of the ceiling fan filled the silence. I thought about Brooke sleeping somewhere else. Maybe in Roger's bed. I thought about the career I'd lost. The friends who stopped calling. The years I'd spent trying to prove I was enough. I opened a bottle of water and stared at my reflection in the window. The man looking back didn't look like someone who'd win anything. But maybe. Just maybe. That was the point. Tomorrow they'd open Richard's envelope in front of the same people who laughed at me. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what they'd see. The morning of the second hearing, I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't slept much. The ceiling fan spun above me, moving the air just enough to make the silence feel louder. My suit hung on the back of a chair. Pressed and ready, I stared at it for a long time, wondering if a man could rebuild his life just by putting on a different jacket. When I got to the courthouse, the parking lot was already filling up. Reporters stood near the entrance, pretending not to wait for me. I walked past them without a word. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Like the day before, Constance was already there, sorting papers at our table. Grace sat next to her, tapping on a laptop. Constance looked up. Morning. Ethan. You ready? I nodded. As ready as a man could be when half his life was about to get dissected in public. Brooke and Roger entered 5 minutes later. She was wearing white this time, like she was going to a photo shoot. Roger held the door for her and whispered something that made her laugh. I looked away. Judge Collins entered and took his seat. The gavel hit once. We all stood. Then sat. Constance rose first. Your Honor, we request the court play the recorded message from the late Richard Fairbanks, executor of the Fairbanks estate, in accordance with Clause 12 of his last will and testament. Roger stood immediately. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to these proceedings. Judge Collins looked down at him. If it concerns either party's financial status or property, it's relevant. Proceed. Ms. Hale. Constance nodded to Grace, who dimmed the lights and set up the screen. My stomach tightened when I saw the first frame appear. It was my Uncle Richard, sitting in a leather chair, wearing the same tweed jacket he used to wear every Thanksgiving. The date stamp showed 3 months ago. He looked straight into the camera. His voice came out steady, warm, familiar. If you're seeing this, it means I'm gone, and that life has played one of its strange jokes again. He smiled faintly. Ethan, you were always the one who tried to fix things. Even when you were little, you wanted everyone to stop fighting, to just be honest. I never forgot that. My throat closed up. I hadn't seen him since my mother's 60th birthday. We'd argued about money, about choices, about nothing important. Richard continued. I built a fortune, but not everything I built was worth keeping. So I created a trust, $280 million in assets. It stands under Brooke Carter's name, with a condition. If she remains your wife in good faith, the trust continues in her name. If she chooses separation or divorce, it transfers entirely to you. Ethan, Brooke gasped, loud enough for everyone to hear. Roger reached for her arm, but she pulled away. Richard's voice stayed calm. I did this because money tests people more than love ever will. You'll both learn what really matters. And Ethan, if you're watching this, don't let bitterness win. It's a poor inheritance. The screen went black. The silence that followed felt like a storm before thunder. Judge Collins leaned back. Hands folded. Roger stood. Your Honor, this is absurd. Clearly. This is an attempt to manipulate the proceedings. Constance stepped forward. The trust is verified and registered through California Probate Court. Here are the documents. Notarized and dated. The judge took the folder, scanned the first page, then looked up. Mr. Blake? Unless you have evidence to contest the authenticity, I see no reason to dismiss. Brooke spoke suddenly, her voice shaking. I didn't know about any of this. I swear. I didn't. Constance turned to her. That's interesting. Mrs. Carter. Because your signature appears on the initial trust documentation from last year. Would you like to explain how it got there? Brooke's face went pale. She looked at Roger, but he avoided her eyes. Judge Collins cleared his throat. We will recess until tomorrow to verify the validity of the estate documents. The gavel came down. The courtroom buzzed instantly. Reporters whispered. Phones came up. And someone near the back muttered something about karma. I stood there frozen. The image of my uncle still in my head. The way he looked at the camera. The weight in his voice. He'd known what was coming. Constance gathered her files calmly. That went about as well as it could. Brooke turned on her heel and stormed out. Roger followed, his face red and tight. Grace handed me a bottle of water. You okay? I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit me again. Too bright. Too hot. A reporter shouted my name, asking if I felt vindicated. I didn't answer. Vindicated wasn't the word. Confused. Maybe haunted. I drove home with the windows down. The desert wind roaring through the car. My uncle's voice kept repeating in my head. Don't let bitterness win. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a white envelope tucked under my door. I picked it up. My name written in neat, formal handwriting. Inside was a short note. Ethan, you'll understand everything soon. Be careful who you trust. It wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting. It was Roger's. I stood there for a long time, the note trembling slightly in my hand. As the last bit of sunlight faded from the sky, I stood on the porch holding that note until the paper felt damp against my skin. I went inside and dropped it on the kitchen counter. The silence in the house was suffocating. Brooke's shoes were still by the door, her favorite mug still sitting upside down in the rack. Everything looked exactly as it had before she left. But it all felt wrong, like I was walking through a museum of my own mistakes. I poured a glass of water and sat down. Be careful who you trust. The words kept circling in my head. Roger's handwriting was unmistakable, and yet it made no sense. Was it guilt? A warning? Or another trap? The next morning, I woke up to a phone buzzing nonstop. Grace's name flashed on the screen. Pick up, she said the moment I answered. It's everywhere. What's everywhere? Turn on the TV? I did. The first thing I saw was my own face on a split screen. Frozen mid-blink. The headline in bold letters, The Man Who Cried for Millions. A news anchor was narrating with a kind of detached amusement. Yesterday's hearing took a surprising turn when a recorded will revealed a $280 million trust tied to the marriage of Ethan and Brooke Carter. The emotional husband broke down in court, sparking debate about masculinity and money in modern relationships. I muted the sound and just stared. My face looked smaller on TV. Weaker. The clip of me wiping my eyes replayed on a loop. They even slowed it down, adding dramatic music. By noon, there were memes. Grace texted me one of them. She didn't mean to be cruel, but it stung anyway. Constance called an hour later. Ethan, don't engage with the media. Let them talk. This will pass. Easy for you to say. I told her. They're making me into a joke. Then let the truth turn the joke back on them. She said. Brooke, on the other hand, was loving it. She appeared on a talk show that same evening, sitting across from a cheerful host who asked if she felt betrayed by her husband's tears. She smiled, practiced and polite. I just want peace, she said. I spent years trying to make things work, but sometimes weakness hides behind kindness. I watched until I couldn't anymore. I threw the remote at the wall. and it cracked in two. Later that night, my mom called from Tucson. "Honey, I saw the news. Are you all right?" I told her I was fine. But she heard the lie. She always did. "Brooke just needs time." Mom said, "She's scared." "No." I said quietly, "She's not scared. She's calculating." There was a pause. "Ethan, your uncle was a good man. Maybe this is his way of setting things right. Maybe." I said, "But it feels like a storm before something worse." When I hung up, I sat in the dark again. Same as every night. Only this time, I wasn't alone. The world was watching. 2 days later, Grace came into Constance's office with a folder and that glint in her eyes that meant trouble for someone else. "You need to see this," she said. She placed bank statements on the desk. Large transfers between Roger's business account and Brooke's checking account. One every month for nearly half a year. The most recent was for $200,000. Constance smiled slightly. "Looks like our Mrs. Carter was receiving compensation for something other than heartbreak." "You think Roger paid her off?" I asked. "He paid her to stay quiet." Constance said. "About what?" "We'll find out soon." That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Mark Jensen, my old co-worker from Metagenics. I haven't heard from him in years. "Ethan," he said. "You got a minute? I saw the news." "Yeah," I said. "I bet everyone did." He hesitated. "There's something you should know about Roger. Back when they fired you, I found a file he shouldn't have had. Expense sheets with your name on them. He told me to destroy it. Said it was none of my business." "You still have it," he exhaled through the phone. "I made a copy." "You want it?" I didn't answer right away. The thought of revenge felt heavy. Like something poisonous you still want to taste. "Bring it to Constance," I said finally. "She'll know what to do." That night, I drove through downtown Phoenix again. Billboards glowed above the freeway. One of them playing the clip of Brooke's interview. Her smile filled the screen. And underneath it ran the words, "Modern women. Modern choices." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. When I got home, I found another envelope in my mailbox. No handwriting this time. Just my address typed neatly. Inside were printed screenshots of Brooke's text messages. Most were between her and Roger. I read them once and then again, each word slicing a little deeper. They joked about the hearing, about me crying, about how easy it would be to make me look unstable. One message from Roger read, "Once he breaks in public, it's over." She replied with a smile emoji. I dropped the papers onto the counter and leaned against the wall. There was no more doubt. They hadn't just betrayed me. They'd planned my humiliation. The next morning, Constance filed a motion to submit the new evidence. Brooke's lawyer didn't respond for hours. When they finally arrived at court, she looked pale. Roger's tie wasn't straight for the first time since I'd known him. Constance whispered before the session began. "The tide's turning. Ethan, keep quiet and stay steady." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice anyway. As we waited for the judge, I glanced across the aisle. Brooke stared down at her hands. For a second, I almost saw the woman I'd married. The one who once sat with me on the porch eating ice cream at midnight because the power had gone out. But the memory faded fast. Judge Collins entered, his robe swaying slightly as he took his seat. Everyone stood. Then, sat. "Ms. Hale," the judge said. "You have additional materials to present." Constance stood, calm and clear. "Yes, Your Honor. Financial records showing a pattern of transactions between Mrs. Prisantid's Carter and her legal counsel, Mr. Blake, which raised significant ethical and criminal concerns." Brooke gasped. Roger's face turned red. "Your Honor, this is out of context," Roger said quickly. "These were reimbursements for consulting fees." The judge looked at him. "Reimbursements from your firm to your client's personal account," Roger hesitated. "Of course, Your Honor. But we'll review this in full tomorrow," the judge said, his voice sharp now. "Until then, court is adjourned." As everyone stood, Brooke shot me a look I couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe, or the realization that the show was over. Outside, the reporters swarmed again, shouting questions. One of them asked if I thought justice was finally coming. I didn't answer. I just walked through the crowd, feeling the heat on my face, the noise fading behind me, replaced by a strange calm. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one on the floor. The next day, the courthouse felt different. The air inside had a weight to it, thick with something close to anticipation. Reporters had doubled, their cameras already flashing when I walked through the doors. Grace met me in the hallway, holding a folder tight to her chest. "Constance is inside," she said. "The judge wants to begin right on time." I nodded and pushed open the heavy door. Brooke was already there, sitting perfectly straight, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Roger sat beside her, flipping through papers like a man pretending to be calm. When his eyes met mine, he looked away. Judge Collins entered a minute later. Everyone stood, then sat. The gavel came down once. "Ms. Hale," the judge said, "you may proceed." Constance rose slowly, setting a small flash drive on the evidence table. "Your Honor, this is the video statement from the late Richard Fairbanks, authenticated and provided by his estate's executor. We request that it be played for the court in full." Roger was on his feet immediately. "Objection. This is irrelevant and prejudicial." "Overruled," said the judge. "Let's see it." Grace dimmed the lights and connected the screen. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. The first image was my uncle, sitting in that leather chair again, surrounded by books and sunlight filtering through blinds. His hair was grayer, but his eyes were sharp. "If you're watching this," he said, "then life has finally caught up to me. Ethan, I hope you're there. You were always the honest one. Maybe too honest. That's a dangerous thing in a world that rewards deceit." He paused, took a slow breath. "I built a fortune, and I've seen what money does to people. So I've chosen to make it a mirror. I created a trust fund valued at $280 million. It currently stands in the name of Brooke Carter, your wife." A ripple of noise moved through the courtroom. Brooke froze. Roger looked up sharply. My uncle continued. "The condition is simple. The trust remains in her name as long as she remains your wife, in good faith, should she choose separation or divorce. The trust, along with all associated assets, transfers entirely to you, Ethan Carter." Brooke's lips parted but no sound came out. The judge lifted a hand for silence. My uncle leaned closer to the camera. "I did this not to punish anyone, but to reveal character. Money doesn't change people. It just shows who they really are. Ethan, if you're hearing this, I trust you to know what's right. Don't let anger own you. Let truth do that." The video ended. The lights came back on, but no one moved. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. Then Brooke stood. Her voice trembled. "I didn't know about any of this. I swear I didn't." Constance didn't blink. "Really? Then perhaps you can explain why your signature appears on this notarized document acknowledging the creation of the trust." Grace handed the page to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Brooke stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. Her face drained of color. Roger jumped in. "Your Honor, there must be some mistake. My client signed numerous papers on behalf of her late uncle's estate. It's possible this was part of a larger administrative process," Constance said quietly. "Administrative processes rarely come with $280 million attached." The judge rubbed his temple. "We'll recess briefly while I review these documents. Do not leave the building." The gavel struck, and everyone began whispering at once. Brooke turned to Roger, hissing something under her breath. He shook his head. "Sweating now." Constance leaned toward me. "Stay calm. Let them unravel." I nodded, but my hands were shaking. 15 minutes later, we were called back. The judge looked different now, more focused, almost tired. "These documents are valid," he said. "The trust exists. The conditions are clear, and the signature matches. We will reconvene tomorrow to determine its legal impact on the divorce proceedings." He stood, and that was it. The gavel came down. Brooke looked at me as she left, eyes wide, her mask cracking for the first time. I couldn't tell if it was anger or fear, maybe both. Roger trailed behind her, his jaw tight, avoiding every camera that pointed his way. Outside, The reporters surrounded me again, shouting questions about the fortune, the trust, my marriage. I didn't answer. I just kept walking until I reached the far end of the parking lot where my old Chevy waited in the sun. Inside the car, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The seat was hot, the steering wheel burning my palms. But it didn't matter. My uncle's voice still echoed in my head. Don't let anger own you. Let truth do that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the back porch with a glass of water, watching the desert sky darken. The cicadas were loud, almost mocking. Every now and then, a car passed on the distant road, headlights slicing through the black. My phone buzzed. A new message. No name. Just a number I didn't recognize. You don't know the whole story. Meet me tomorrow before court. Same diner as before. It ended there. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. The next morning, I drove to the diner from weeks ago. Grace's old Honda was already parked outside. She was in a booth, stirring her coffee like she'd been waiting for hours. When she saw me, she slid a small recorder across the table. Listen, she said. I pressed play. Roger's voice filled the space. Keep quiet about the trust, he said. If she files fast enough, we can still get ahead of it. She laughed. I just have to make him look unstable. Right. After that, it's mine. Grace looked at me. They recorded that conversation at a bar near Scottsdale 2 nights before the first hearing. The bartender's a friend of mine. He saved the footage. I didn't say anything. The sound of my pulse drowned everything out. You have them. Ethan, she said softly. It's over. Maybe. But sitting there, watching the sunlight hit the greasy counter, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. When I got back in my car, I thought about my uncle again. About how he must have known all this would happen. Maybe he hadn't just left me money. Maybe he'd left me a way out. Tomorrow the court would hear everything. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't afraid of walking back into that room. The courthouse was quieter than usual that morning. As if everyone sensed what was coming, I walked through the front doors with Constance beside me, Grace following close behind. The marble floor echoed under our steps. For the first time, I didn't feel like a man walking to his own execution. I felt like someone walking into a reckoning. Inside, Brooke and Roger sat together at the same table. But something had changed. They weren't leaning toward each other anymore. They barely made eye contact. Brooke's hands kept moving, twisting a pen, then setting it down, then picking it up again. Roger's jaw flexed. His papers spread out but untouched. Constance leaned over and whispered, "They're coming apart. Let them." Judge Collins answered, and the room rose. The gavel hit once. We took our seats. Ms. Hale. The judge said, "You may proceed with your new submission." Constance stood. "Thank you. Your Honor, in light of yesterday's testimony and the discovery of the Fairbanks Trust, we are introducing additional evidence related to the actions of both Mrs. Knight, Carter, and her counsel, Mr. Blake." She nodded to Grace, who stepped forward and placed a small recording device on the table. This audio was obtained legally from a cooperating witness at the Cactus Lounge in Scottsdale. The voices belonged to Mrs. Carter and Mr. Blake. Roger's chair screeched as he stood. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Sit down. Mr. Blake," the judge said evenly. The courtroom fell silent as the audio played. Roger's voice came through first, sharp and impatient. "Keep quiet about the trust," he said. "If she files fast enough, we can still get ahead of it." Then Brooke's voice, softer but cruel in its calm. "I just have to make him look unstable." "Right. After that, it's mine." There was a collective gasp. Even the court reporter looked up. Brooke's face drained of color. Roger sat down heavily. Staring at the table, Constance let the silence hang before speaking. "Your Honor, this recording was captured 48 hours before the first hearing. Combined with the bank transfers between Mr. Blake's firm and Mrs. Carter's account, we believe this demonstrates collusion and fraud." Judge Collins leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. His voice was low when he spoke. "Mr. Blake, do you have any response?" Roger swallowed hard. The recording is incomplete. Context matters. The judge raised an eyebrow. Context rarely redeems conspiracy. Mr. Blake. Brooke spoke suddenly, her voice rising. He told me to do it. He said it was the only way to win. Roger turned on her, his voice breaking. You were already doing it before I said a word. Don't you dare put this on me. Their argument spilled out, raw and unfiltered. Every eye in the courtroom watched them tear each other apart. The judge finally struck his gavel. Enough. Both of you. Sit down. The gavel hit again. Harder this time. Constance stayed standing, calm and unmoved. Your Honor, in light of this evidence, I ask that the court dismiss Mrs. Carter's claims of emotional distress and grant immediate review of the Fairbanks Trust. The judge nodded slowly. The request is granted. We'll reconvene tomorrow for final judgment. The room buzzed again as people whispered to each other. Brooke was shaking, muttering to herself, while Roger gathered his papers with trembling hands. Outside the courtroom, the press was already waiting. Cameras flashed. Microphones pushed forward. I didn't say a word. Constance guided me through the chaos, her hand firm on my arm. When we reached the parking lot, she finally spoke. Tomorrow. This ends. I stared at the horizon. The Arizona sky was cloudless, a pale blue that stretched forever. I thought of my uncle's words again. Let truth own you. That night I couldn't bring myself to go home. Instead, I drove to my parents' place in Tucson. The drive took 2 hours. The highway empty, except for the glow of truck headlights. My dad was in the garage when I arrived, wiping grease from his hands. He looked up, surprised. Son, you look like you haven't slept in days. I haven't, I said. But it's almost over. He nodded slowly, the way he always did when he didn't know what else to say. My mom came out from the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. She hugged me tighter than she had since I was a kid. I told them everything. About the trust, the recordings, the lies. My mom listened quietly, shaking her head every now and then. My dad just kept muttering, I knew that girl wasn't right for you. When I finished, my mom said softly, maybe your uncle knew you needed this. Not the money, the truth. I looked around the house I'd grown up in, the old photos on the wall, the worn furniture. For a moment, I felt grounded again. Later, I sat out back under the desert sky, the air cool against my skin. A few stars flickered above the dark outline of the mountains. My mom came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. You're stronger than you think, she said. You always were. I smiled faintly. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling it, she said. It's about standing when everything in you wants to fall. We sat there a long time without speaking. The next morning, as I drove back to Phoenix, I passed the same diner where Grace had given me the recording. The sign flickered in the sunlight. For a moment, I thought about stopping, about just sitting inside and pretending the world was simple again. But I kept driving. By the time I reached the courthouse, the parking lot was already full. Constance and Grace were waiting by the steps. She looked at me and gave a small nod. Ready, I took a breath and nodded back. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches. Even people who had nothing to do with the case had come just to see how it would end. As the judge entered and everyone rose, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For months, I had been dragged through humiliation, betrayal, and loss. But now, for the first time, I wasn't the one on trial. When we sat, Constance leaned close and whispered, "Let them speak first. The truth doesn't need help." And for the first time since this all began, I believed her. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the sound of the gavel echoed like a door closing behind everything I used to be. Brooke sat to my left, her face pale and still. Roger was beside her, the confident smirk long gone. His suit looked wrinkled, his hands restless on the table. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the judge. Judge Collins began to speak, his voice measured but heavy. This court has reviewed the evidence, including financial records, communications, and the recording presented yesterday. The findings are clear. There was a deliberate attempt to manipulate these proceedings through collusion and fraud. He paused, letting the words sink in. The reporters scribbled furiously. Brooke lowered her head. Roger stared at the floor. The judge continued. The Fairbanks Trust is a valid and legally binding document. The condition of the trust is explicit. Should Mrs. Carter proceed with divorce or act in bad faith, all assets revert to Mr. Ethan Carter. Therefore, the court recognizes Mr. Carter as the rightful beneficiary of the Fairbanks estate in its entirety. The room fell silent. I didn't move. It was as if my body hadn't caught up to my mind. Brooke turned to me then, eyes wide, searching for something in my face. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe weakness. She spoke in a low voice that barely carried across the table. This isn't fair. You just cried and everyone felt sorry for you. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, you will refrain from commentary or risk being held in contempt. Her words came out louder this time. He's not strong. He's not brave. He's just a pathetic man who couldn't keep his wife happy. Judge Collins' voice cut through the noise like steel. Mrs. Carter, I suggest you stop. But she didn't. She pointed at me. Look at him. He's sitting there like he's some kind of hero. You think money will fix what you are? Before I could respond, the judge leaned forward. Sometimes. Mrs. Carter. Those who appear weak are simply the ones who refuse to lose their humanity. He struck the gavel once more. Court is adjourned. The sound filled the room like thunder. Cameras flashed. The clerk started gathering papers. Reporters rushed to the aisles shouting questions. Brooke stayed frozen in her chair. Roger was already standing, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. Constance turned to me. It's over, she said softly. I stood and walked out without a word. The hallway outside was chaos. People pressed forward. Microphones in my face. Voices shouting questions I couldn't even hear clearly. Did you know about the trust? Are you planning to keep the money? Do you forgive your wife? I kept walking. Past the cameras. Past the security guards trying to keep order. When I finally stepped outside, the sunlight hit my eyes and everything went quiet. Constance caught up to me near the parking lot. You handled that well, she said. Most people would have thrown something by now. I gave a small laugh that didn't sound like me. Maybe I'm just too tired. She smiled faintly. Maybe you're finally free. I looked back at the courthouse. The crowd still buzzing at the entrance. It felt strange, realizing that the building behind me held both my humiliation and my vindication. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. The road stretched ahead, bright and empty. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. But I didn't look at it. I needed silence. I needed to hear my own thoughts again. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same as the day she left. Her shoes were still by the door. Her perfume still faint in the hallway. I walked through each room slowly, as if saying goodbye to a ghost. In the kitchen, I found the same mug she used every morning. I picked it up, stared at it, then set it back down. I didn't feel anger anymore, just exhaustion and something like peace. Later that evening, I sat outside on the porch. The desert air was cooling, and the sun was bleeding into the horizon. My phone buzzed again. This time, I answered. It was Grace. You should turn on the news, she said. Roger Blake has been disbarred pending investigation. The state bar found evidence of financial misconduct in 2 other cases. I didn't respond right away. What about Brooke? She paused. She'll face charges too. Fraud and perjury. Her lawyer already withdrew. I let out a long breath. Thank you, Grace. After I hung up, I leaned back in my chair. The sky above me was turning dark, a deep blue scattered with faint stars. I thought about my uncle, about the man who'd set all of this in motion long before I knew I'd need saving. He'd known how people would reveal themselves when tested. My phone buzzed one last time that night. A text from an unknown number. It was short. You think you've won. You haven't. I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. The next morning, I met Constance at her office to finalize the paperwork. She poured 2 coffees and handed me one. You realize you're now one of the richest men in Arizona, she said. I smiled faintly. I don't feel rich. That's good, she said. It means you'll know what to do with it. When I left her office, the reporters were waiting again. I walked past them. Same as before. But this time I wasn't hiding. Someone shouted after me, asking what I planned to do with all that money. I stopped, turned slightly, and said, maybe I'll start over. Then I kept walking. That night, I packed a small bag and drove west toward the coast. The road was long and empty, the sky turning gold as I crossed into California, somewhere near Malibu. I pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out. The ocean stretched out in front of me, endless and alive. The sound of the waves was steady, like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes and let the wind hit my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel broken. Behind me, the last light of the sun disappeared below the water, and I knew that whatever came next, it would finally be mine to choose. The next morning I woke up in a small beachfront hotel, the kind with faded curtains and the smell of salt in the air. The ocean was just beyond the window, the sound of waves constant and calm. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of quiet that didn't ache. I made coffee in the little room pot and sat by the window, watching the sunlight spill across the water. My phone buzzed on the table. Dozens of missed calls, unread messages. I ignored them all until one name caught my eye. It was my mother. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft with relief. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just needed some air. We saw everything on TV. Your father was ready to drive to Phoenix. He's proud of you. You know." I smiled faintly. "Tell him he doesn't have to. It's done." There was a pause. "Brooke's mother was on the news this morning, saying things about you, about the money." "Of course she was." She sounded worried. "You're not angry, are you?" "Not anymore," I said. "Anger takes too much energy." After we hung up, I looked out at the ocean again. The horizon seemed endless, but it didn't scare me. It felt like possibility. Later that afternoon, I drove back to Phoenix. My house looked different in the daylight. The lawn was overgrown, a few letters piled up by the door. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. Empty rooms, silent walls. I started packing the things that still mattered. Old photos, a few books, my father's watch. I left everything else behind. When I turned on the TV that evening, I wasn't surprised to see my face again. The headline read, "From Failure to Fortune, The Rise of Ethan Carter." They showed clips of the trial, my tears, the video of my uncle. Then they cut to Brooke walking quickly into a courthouse. Cameras flashing. Her lawyer was gone. She had no defense left. The anchor said the district attorney was investigating charges of fraud and perjury. The footage changed to Roger, his suit rumpled, his eyes hollow. The reporter called it one of the fastest disbarments in state history. He refused to answer questions. Someone shouted if he regretted it. He didn't look back. I turned off the TV and sat there for a while, the silence pressing in. I didn't feel victorious, just tired. A few days later, Constance called. She wanted to meet for lunch. We met at a quiet cafe near her office, the kind of place where no one cared who you were. She arrived with Grace, both of them smiling for the first time since this all began. "You look lighter," Constance said. "I guess I am. You have decisions to make now. The estate, the investments, everything your uncle left. It's a lot to handle." "I know. I'm still figuring it out." She leaned back in her chair. "If you'll take my advice, don't let it sit too long. Money gets restless when it doesn't move." Grace grinned. "You could always donate a little. Maybe start a foundation. People would actually root for you instead of just talking about you." I smiled. "That's not a bad idea." After lunch, I walked through downtown Phoenix. It was hot, the kind of dry heat that makes everything shimmer. People passed by without recognizing me. A street musician played guitar near a fountain. For a moment, I stood and listened. It felt good to just be another face in the crowd. That evening, I drove to Tucson to see my parents. My mom opened the door before I could knock. She hugged me so hard I almost dropped the bag in my hand. My dad was in the living room watching a baseball game. He muted the TV when he saw me. "You did good, son," he said simply. We had dinner together, just the three of us. Mom made roast chicken. The same meal she used to make when things were bad, and she wanted us to feel normal again. We talked about everything except the trial. After dinner, she showed me an article someone from church had printed. It was from a local paper, talking about the trust in the case. The last line said, "Ethan Carter's story reminds us that decency doesn't mean weakness." I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. That night, I slept in my old room, the one with the cracked ceiling and the faint smell of motor oil from my dad's shop. I slept without dreams. A week later, I met Constance again. This time at her office. She slid a document across her desk. It was the formal transfer of the Fairbanks Trust. $280 million. My signature was the only thing missing. I looked at it for a long time. "You don't have to take it," she said quietly. "There are other ways to honor him." I thought of my uncle, sitting in that chair, his voice steady as he said, "Don't let anger own you." I signed the papers. Then I told her what I wanted to do. I want to start a foundation for people who lost everything because someone lied. Victims of workplace fraud, false accusations, ruined reputations. Call it the Fairbanks Fund. Constance smiled. That's exactly what he would have done. By the end of the month, the foundation was up and running. Reporters wanted interviews again, but I turned them all down. The story was no longer about me. It was about what could come from the wreckage. One morning, Grace stopped by my office at the foundation's temporary space downtown. She dropped a stack of mail on my desk. The top envelope was handwritten. I opened it and found a short note. It said, "I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it." No signature. But I knew the handwriting. "Brooks." I stared at it for a while, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I stood outside the building as the sun went down, watching the city lights flicker on. A man passed by, holding his little girl's hand. She looked up at him, laughing at something he said. I found myself smiling too. I'd spent years trying to prove I was strong. Now I understood that strength had nothing to do with how hard you could fight. Sometimes it was just about how long you could stand in the fire and still walk out human. The desert wind picked up, warm and familiar, somewhere in the distance. I could almost hear my uncle's voice again. "Don't let anger own you. Let truth do that." I stood there until the last light disappeared, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the truth finally belonged to me. A few months passed before I started feeling like a normal person again. The news cycle had moved on to something else, and the world forgot my name. I liked it that way. The Fairbanks Fund was growing fast, helping people who had been destroyed by lies and greed. Every week I met men and women who had been fired unfairly, betrayed by partners, or left with nothing after someone else's mistake. Every story reminded me of the man I used to be, sitting in a parking lot behind a Walmart thinking life was over. One afternoon, Grace walked into my office holding a stack of letters. "You should read this one," she said, setting an envelope on my desk. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. I opened it and began to read. It was from a man in Ohio whose company had accused him of theft. He lost everything. But one of our lawyers had cleared his name. He wrote, "You gave me my life back. I don't have much, but if you're ever in Cleveland, I owe you dinner." I smiled, folded the letter, and placed it in a small box I kept by the window. The box was half full already. I didn't know why I kept them. Maybe I just needed proof that something good had come from all the pain. That evening, I drove to the beach again. The sunset was burning gold against the water, the same as the first night I'd arrived in California. I walked along the shore until I reached the rocks where the tide crashed hardest. For the first time, I thought about Brooke without anger. She'd been wrong, cruel even. But she'd also been lost in her own hunger for more. People like her didn't see love as enough. They saw it as a trade. I finally understood that wasn't my burden anymore. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Constance. I answered, listening to her familiar, calm voice. "The Foundation's first public report came out today," she said. "You might want to read it." I sat on the sand, opened the link she sent, and scrolled. The headline read, "The Fairbanks Fund, Justice with Compassion." The article talked about what we'd built, how we'd helped over 400 people in less than 6 months, How every dollar came from the fortune my uncle had left behind. At the bottom was a quote from him, taken from the video he recorded. "Money means nothing if it doesn't repair what's broken." I looked out at the waves. The sound was the same rhythm as my heartbeat, steady and calm. Later that week, I visited my parents again. My dad was teaching my nephew how to change the oil on the old Chevy in the driveway. My mom was sitting on the porch, reading. She smiled when she saw me. "You look better," she said. "I feel better," I told her. We had dinner together again, laughing more than we had in years. My father poured a small glass of whiskey afterward and raised it. "To your uncle," he said. "He was crazy, but he did right by you. To all of us," I said, clinking my glass against his. That night, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. Kids were riding bikes down the street, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air. The smell of barbecue drifted from a backyard somewhere. For a moment, I let myself imagine what life might have been like if none of it had happened. If Brooke hadn't betrayed me. If Roger hadn't lied. If I'd just kept working and believing everything was fine. I realized I would have stayed small. Safe. But small. Sometimes destruction is the only thing that forces you to build again. Stronger than before. When I got back to Phoenix, the city looked different. Or maybe I did. The lights seemed warmer. Less harsh. The air smelled like rain. I drove past my old office building, now owned by someone else. A for lease sign hung crooked in the window. I parked across the street for a minute, watching the empty rooms inside. That chapter of my life was truly over. The next morning, Grace walked into my office with her laptop open. "There's something you need to see," she said. She turned the screen toward me. It was an article about Roger. He'd been sentenced to 12 years for fraud and obstruction. His statement to the court said he regretted everything, that greed had ruined his life. I read the last line twice. The judge called it the most calculated act of betrayal he'd seen in his career. I closed the laptop and looked at Grace. "You ever think revenge isn't something you do? But something that happens when you stop needing it?" She smiled. "Maybe that's the best kind." A few weeks later, I visited my uncle's grave in Santa Barbara. The headstone was simple. Just his name, and the words he built quietly. I stood there for a long time. The ocean wind cool on my face. I told him about the foundation. About my parents. About the people we'd helped. I thanked him for everything. Even the chaos. Then I whispered something I hadn't said to anyone. I forgive them. All of them. As I walked back to the car, I felt lighter. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my apartment overlooking the city. The lights shimmered like stars fallen to earth. My life wasn't what I'd planned, but it was mine again. I had rebuilt it from ashes, one honest piece at a time. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear my uncle's voice. Patient and steady. "Don't let anger own you. Let truth do that." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything behind me finally lift. Then I smiled, ready for whatever came next. If you made it to the end of this story, maybe it found you for a reason. Maybe you've lost something too. Maybe someone tried to break you. Don't let them win. Keep standing. Keep building. Leave your story below. Tell me what you rebuilt after they thought you were finished. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming everything they said you never could be.